Welcome everyone! When we're talking about romantic chess, chess that's really all about playing boldly and winning in style, we have to mention Mikhail Chigorin, and he was so great that he's also considered the founder of the Russian school of chess, the first Russian GM, and he was even put on the Russian stamps. Anyway, all you really need to know is that he played amazing and exciting chess, so it was about time to check out his games. Let's get this started. He played the German chess master Richard Teichmann. Teichmann had white and opened with d4, d5, c4, and after knight to c6, it's Chigorin's very own variation of the Queen's Gambit. It immediately deviates from the classical teachings. Black doesn't support the d-pawn, but instead wants to pressure white's d-pawn, and the knight also blocks the c-pawn. However, black often gets active piece play and it favors the player who likes dynamic positions, and Chigorin certainly was one of those players. Now, I did cover a game in this defense before, then played by Alexander Morozevich. There they followed this line with knight to c3 and d takes c4, but today we see something completely different. Here Teichmann went knight to f3, and this move has a clear threat. White now wants to take on d5. Just going back for a second, if white would take on d5 right away, then after queen takes, white cannot develop the knight with a tempo because d4 is hanging. So by going knight to f3 here, black does threaten to take on d5 and hit the queen with knight to c3 because d4 is defended. Now, bishop to g4 by Chigorin. As I said, instead of defending his own d-pawn, black wants to attack white's d-pawn. White can play in a number of ways here. In this case, white took on d5, and the point is that black now has to take on f3, because again, after queen takes d5, knight to c3 hits the queen, and black just gets a dreadful game. So black does take. White again can play in more ways than one. Taking the bishop both ways is fine, but taking on c6 is another way of playing, and that's what Teichmann did. And now, of course, bishop takes pawn. Now, modern analysis shows that, objectively speaking, white really got nothing out of the opening, but still white can go knight to c3 and get a big center with e4, so it doesn't mean black's game will be easy, but black again does get active piece play, and often black will even strike back at white's center with f5. There was a slightly different approach in this game after knight to c3 and e6. White's best is to claim the center with e4, and when black pins the knight, white defends with f3. And for example, in a game between Pillsbury and Chigorin, Chigorin did go for f5 and he won a really nice game. Going back to the game, Teichmann went his own way. He wanted to develop his bishop first, because he wants to go e3 instead, and then the bishop won't be locked in by the pawns. It continued knight to f6, e3, and now bishop to b4 by Chigorin. He wants to exploit the fact that the dark squared bishop is outside the pawn chain. Now knight to d5 would put more pressure on the knight and also attack the bishop. Probably white should just play a3 to force the issue, but instead Teichmann put the question to the bishop like this. But this doesn't stop knight to d5, so Chigorin played it. The bishop was notched back, castles, and after bishop to d3, Chigorin showed his keen eye for tactics. He went queen to g5, which stops white from castling because of bishop takes knight, pawn takes, and knight takes e3. And if white would take, then queen takes pawn picks up the bishop, and black simply won 2 pawns. White saw that, queen to c2 guards the bishop, but now a typical move for this variation, f7, f5. But of course it also counters white's attack on the h-pawn. White secured the bishop on e5, targeting g7. Rook to f7, just keeping an eye on g7, but on c7 as well. Taking on g2 doesn't lose, but it does make things very easy for white. After castles, the rook threatens to come over, which will also hit g7. So queen to h3. But then the rook comes over anyway, and after rook to f7, simply rook to g3 and doubling rooks, and clearly by winning that pawn, black's only given an easy game to white. Therefore rook f7 instead, and here white showed his intent and castled queenside. Castling on opposite sides always raises the stakes, but on the other hand, castling on the king side is too dangerous for white now anyway. And now we see a very straightforward but strong strategy by Chigorin on the queen side. First, bishop takes knight, forcing white to loosen up the pawn structure, and then b5. For now that secures the position of black's knight on d5, but at the right time b4 may also be played, which would open up the king even more. And there's a third point. There's a couple of games where Chigorin combined b5 with rook to b6 and involved the rook in the attack. That doesn't end up happening in this game, but I'm sure he was thinking about it. Here white decided to guard g2 anyway, but Chigorin had something more important in mind. He set his mind on white's king. And already we can see a benefit of trading on c3. A check on a3 is now imminent. It seems to me that king to b2 is therefore by far the most logical, simply stopping that threat. Instead white played rook from d to f1. I must say I'm not sure why that was played. Maybe he thought about moving the king to d1 after the check, but then he must have changed his mind, because after the check the king moved to d2. Probably to hold on to the c-pawn, but now white's in desperate trouble. b4 is now a great move, c3 is hanging, and if white takes, then knight takes b4 is very strong. c4 was played to avoid knight takes b4, but then the bishop also joined in, targeting the queen, and after queen to b1, the knight jumped in the heart of white's camp, again with a hit on the queen, and then rook to d8 was played, opposing the king. That rook was doing nothing on a8, and now it's yet another threat to the white king. g4 was then played, but it's far too late to get any kind of play. Chigorin went knight e4 check. Everything loses at this point. If white would take, then white is just helpless. If queen to b1 to stop queen d3 check, then queen c3 check, take on c4 with check, and here queen c3 and bishop b5 force the king to the d file, and then c5 will unleash the rook on d8. That's just a hopeless position. Teichmann instead moved the king, but the knight isn't done yet. Knight to c5 was crushing, and white doesn't have a good response. If white would take, then queen d3 check and queen e4 check. The king has to go back, otherwise queen g4 is mate, so king to e2. And after queen c4 check and king to e1, f4 leaves white defenseless. The pawn will either advance to f3 and it's a quick checkmate, or if white takes, then queen e4 check is equally deadly. And moving the bishop instead also doesn't improve things, because knight to b3 wins the queen. Therefore white tried queen to b1 to guard his piece, but let's see how Chigorin wrapped this up. First knight takes bishop, queen takes, then queen takes a2 check, and after king to f3, bishop to c2 forced Teichmann to resign. Let's quickly see what could have happened if queen to d2, then bishop e4 check with a discovered attack on the queen, king to e2 defends, but then bishop f3 check deflects the king, and white has to accept losing the queen, otherwise queen a1 check and queen d1 will be the end for the king. Well, hopefully you agree that was a nice introduction to Mikhail Chigorin. He decided to take white on with his very own Chigorin defense, but it seemed white didn't want the sharpest continuation by going for this bishop to f4 move instead of simply e2, e4. Chigorin then got this typical play with f5. Castling on the queen side then backfired on white after allowing this check and b4. And once you allowed Chigorin to attack, that was often very bad news. Anyway, do let me know in the comments what you think of this game. Also, let me know if you want to see more of these old games from the 1800s or the early 1900s. I'd be very happy to check those out. Please like the video if you enjoyed, and I'll be seeing you guys again soon, and take care.